Imagine you have just been given the opportunity to press a button, which will cause all life in the universe to immediately experience eudaimonia, the ultimate balance between happiness, pleasure, bliss, with all of the necessary pain and suffering and failure in order to appreciate the learning, growth, and success. The universe that we would then begin to experience would be utopic in every way that that word can be interpreted as good. There is no boredom or destruction as a result of our stagnation, and for all intents and purposes, this is everybody's perfectly subjective heaven. There is one quirk, however. As soon as you press this button, every single living entity becomes an antinatalist. Now, I just want to make things perfectly clear. This outcome is not an inevitable consequence of achieving eudaimonia, but rather it is a deliberate choice, marking a fundamental shift in the course of existence. Because after pressing that button, there is no more procreation. Owing to this fact, the moment our last living entity sighs her last breath of old age, life as we know it, and as we do not know it, begins its eternal cessation. No more humans, apes, birds, lizards, single-cell organisms, trees, aliens, whatever you may consider to exist, one day exist, or have consciousness, vanishes from reality forever. In fact, consciousness itself can no longer exist because consciousness is the primary medium of experience, and that which experiences must be alive. So the trade is very clear: the best possible life for the end of all life. Now imagine a second scenario, a universe much like our own, where there is currently an unquestionably tremendous amount of suffering en masse. But despite the terrible evils that are proliferated, general well-being is on the rise. Evidence suggests that the overall quality of life in this universe has gotten incrementally better as time goes on. The minimum requirements of life, like food, shelter, water, have become vastly more accessible in tandem with technological and informational advancements. Systems are getting better at predicting good and bad outcomes. People are learning about the importance of mental health, and while the prevalence of physical health's importance may be presently reduced below levels that would contribute positively to overall well-being, global society is beginning to recognize the cyclical nature of reality and ideologies, such that concepts like body positivity and nutritional health retain only their beneficial constituents while blending harmoniously into a single medium point on their continuum, much like the pendulum of a clock stopping dead in its center. And this blending of truth transcends physical health, expanding to all endeavors of consciousness, which will eventually lead to a more balanced approach to life. And this eventuality is actually what's most important here. Because while this universe may not be everyone's perfectly subjective heaven, it's also not their perfectly subjective hell either, at least not in its totality. And the truth is that in this universe, life is far better than it was 2,000 years ago or even 200 years ago, despite everyone's nostalgic impressions of the generations before them, or even their own childhood. There is less famine, less war, less raping and pillaging, lower infant mortality rates, and by every other measurable metric, the average rate of suffering is continuously decreasing with the progression of time. And so the utopia that we mentioned in the former option, in this scenario, is only an eventuality, so long as there is patience, effort, and hope. By now you have probably realized that the latter option is in fact the reality that we live in. In the infancy of this problem's emergence, I wondered if even such a contemplative exercise was worthy of consideration. Can happiness and the continuation of life ever be divorced? Yet, to my surprise and astonishment, when I presented this problem to my friends and colleagues, many of them did in fact choose option A, albeit in acquiescence. But it is in this exact reluctance that I find the central demonstration of my point. If in our deliberation we ever find the slightest intimation of selfishness, egoism, guilt, shame, we have to ask ourselves what our moral intuitions are revealing to us. It is quite apparent that one fundamentally immoral yet completely understandable justification in choosing the former is in escaping one's own personal hell. The devil sits on our shoulders singing a song of death's inevitability and asks us what it matters to us what lies beyond. So what it really comes down to is selfishness. But even more than that, it is this illusion of life being a primordial and perennial suffering. That facade of life being nothing more than a black cloud of pain, hate, evil, sadness, and that it's never going to get better. But the fact of the matter is that life is not just pure suffering. In fact, suffering is merely a state of mind employed by consciousness to aid in survival and self-preservation. In fact, many people experience absolute bliss while subjected to seemingly unendurable agony, while others who comparatively have gained everything positive the material world has to offer them, and by all accounts of success should be deeply satisfied in life, are nonetheless shrouded in misery. Trust me when I say that I am not condoning the mistreatment, exploitation, or invalidation of the negative experience of any living entity. I am simply stating that suffering, much like pleasure, is a fleeting experience whose relationship need not be bound to true happiness. Just as only a fool will see the purpose of life in hedonism, so too will he only see pain and suffering everywhere he walks. Conversely, consciousness itself such a rarity that it should be looked at as awe-inspiring, if not puzzling. Consider the infinite nothingness that consciousness must emerge from. Then consider how you somehow participate in this emergence. Consider the infinite lives that do not exist, yet somehow you and I are here to experience life and all of its love, beauty, ecstasy, and pure goodness. Now, I just want to reiterate again, I am not suggesting we sit around hunting the good stuff while the world burns down around us. Things need fixing, which requires, at minimum, the recognition of issues. But to dwell on the idea that a single component of life, like suffering, is life in its totality, is a needlessly false belief that incapacitates us from our ability to direct our cognitive energies towards more productive enterprises, such as the elimination of suffering. This does not mean, however, that in choosing the former, one cannot believe to be practicing selfless altruism. In fact, on the contrary, many people will say that their justification is founded primarily in the eradication of suffering for all, especially those living in the worst possible conditions, a subjective hell. What I would first say to those who choose the former is that it is an unfortunate fact that many of us are not afforded the position to recognize how consciousness is a trans-contextual wellspring of positive emotion. that the conditions themselves do not grant us the opportunity to realize how little a role external factors play in psychological states of being. Let us say, for the sake of the discussion, that controlling psychological states of being is off the table. I believe that the centerpiece then becomes a debate around guarantees and potentialities, as well as of justice. So this argument illusions itself to comply with collective morality, since everyone seems to be happy, right? But I would argue not to celebrate so soon, since it suggests that there's more inherent value in the guaranteed overturning of present suffering than there is in the potential happiness through the future eradication of suffering experienced by exponentially more people in the future. One generation of the good life somehow takes preference over the millennia of positive experiences expected to come after us. However, this impetuous and short-sighted point of view fails to see the inherent value in expected lives. Just as murder strips justice from the thrown individual by robbing her of an expectation of living, which, in other words, in our case, is synonymous with the potential to live, such is the case with those lives yet to exist. It is the expectation of life which is being mugged in an alleyway. And nullification of injustice owing to the simple lack of consciousness, as expressed in our opening thought experiment, is a patently incorrect assumption to be had. Yes, it is true that consciousness is the only thing that moral inquiries can be applied to, meaning that morality does not concern itself with non-conscious objects, and that without consciousness, morality would not exist. But it is the removal of consciousness itself which is immoral, owing to the expectation of life. Why not snap your fingers and end all life now? Yes, this would be murder, but if life is mere experience, then it should not matter, since there will be no conscious beings to witness it. All life would be gone. Morality has nothing to apply to. How can we not view this scenario with the same judgment as the lives lost in the opening question? Now, if we say it's because there's an expectation of life to those present, and killing them is a sort of injustice where they are not given what they're owed by fulfilling the end of their lives naturally, I would say that this is largely inconsistent with claims that future lives are not owed anything as well. Perhaps it is true that there are no particular specified lives, but surely there will indeed be lives in the future that are owed this experience of living. Simply because they are not present yet does not suggest that life itself is not owed anything. Consider this. If a man murders the cow of a rancher in Texas, the murderer must financially recompensate the rancher 3 generations worth of cows. And let me ask you, why was the rancher owed anything for potential lives? And I would also like to add that in this scenario, we are not the rancher. Consciousness is. This intuitive moral dissonance, the feeling that when you really look hard enough, is framed in selfishness and the seceding impetus to justify such a rationalization with the suffering of others, is all preceded by biological law, and even further, subphysical law. That is, that which does not desire to live will eventually fade away. And since humans are not immortal as individuals, our will to self-preservation is subordinate to an even greater system which aims for this immortality: collective preservation. Much like a single cell in service to a great body of collective cells, which make up conscious entities, humans, while important as individuals, are also integral to the survival of consciousness as a whole. Collective preservation is baked in to our very genome and is the entire foundation of the human enterprise. And the only reason self-preservation would ever surpass collective preservation is in the constant struggle between sacrificing present pleasure for greater future happiness, a dichotomy which parallels the issue that we see here in our opening question. I want to make it clear that this is not an argument for procreation as the existential answer. Any individual can find their purpose exists outside the domain of parenthood. If, however, humanity in its entirety decided of its own volition, as if that actually existed, to become antinatalist, I would urge the observation of our environment so as to locate the causes of such a psychological malady. Ideologies and mass hysteria like this can often be attributed to civil and economic unrest, and generally the influence of the environment on the individual's inability to find fulfillment elsewhere. In fact, purpose goes much deeper than simply busying ourselves with the continuation of the species. Rather, it is in the aiming itself that one becomes fulfilled. And I will discuss this more in future videos when I start talking about concepts like creation and understanding. My point remains that life is not just mere experience. There is a trajectory and, dare I say, an obligation to maintain it. But it is also not just mere procreation. Evolution has created a mind which craves certain necessary conditions that, when fulfilled, incrementally contribute to an exceedingly greater level of fulfillment. Thus, with procreation and experience, each one necessitates the other, as in the co-orbital configuration of a binary star system.